Hello and welcome to CIBER Focus, your source for global business information. I'm your host, Tim Smith, and our guest today is Angelina Davydova. Miss Davydova works as an environmental and climate journalist, writing for Russian and international media. She serves as director of the Bureau of Environmental Information and is also a lecturer at St. Petersburg State University in Russia. Currently, she's a fellow with the Humphrey Fellowship Program at University of California, Davis. Today, Angelina will discuss Russian green economy, current environment and climate policy in Russia, as well as what today's Russian civil society looks like. Angelina, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me today. It's a great pleasure and a great honor for me to be here.
And welcome back to Bloomington.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, let's start with Russia's green economy. Russia's green economy. What are the key discussions taking place both in the government and the private sector, and how are the reforms being developed and practiced?
So there are a number of very urgent environmental issues which both the Russian government and Russian business community are trying to tackle. And to give it in a more of a historical perspective, as you probably know, Russia has been in this transformation phase from the Soviet and post-Soviet economy to its modern economy, which some economies still call emerging. And so in many ways, some of the environmental issues which we had back in the Soviet years are gone, right? So quite a number of polluting industries closed down. So in many regions of the country, air quality and water quality have actually become better.
Great.
But then, on the other hand, new economic development brought up a number of completely new environmental challenges. And if I were to put challenge number one, something that literally everyone is worried about, like a topic where any citizen, if you stop him or her on the street and ask them, what is the environmental challenge for Russia number one? They'll tell you waste. That's a really urgent issue. Growing consumption, also growing consumption of disposable goods, something that you only use once. Landfills overfilled. So that all needs urgent reform. And there's an ongoing reform of waste management in Russia. Up till now, around 90% of all household waste has been taken out to landfills. Now, with the landfills being gradually filled, and last year there's been this really interesting case when, if you speak about Moscow, which is Russia's capital, and Moscow produces something like 1/5 of all household waste in Russia. And in a way, Moscow is surrounded by a circle of landfills. But then Moscow is also a growing city, and you have a more and more new urban development being built around the city. And this comes into conflicting interests, right? So interests of people who want to live in a nice, clean environment, but then also managers of landfills, which take it out of Moscow. So there's been this really massive public protests against these landfills, urging local governments to close them down. So the idea now, what do we do about it? And it's obviously that environmentalists want to see more recycling taking place. More recycling in terms of garbage pickup and in terms of recycling facilities. And we see that developing very slowly, but still developing. And there are also plans to build a few incineraries. These plans, once again, face very active protest movement in most of the places where they want to be built. But overall, I would say waste reform is an issue number one. Then if we speak about other issues, that would be an ongoing reform of environmental regulation. Russia is at the brink of launching a new system which will be based on the best available control technologies, which you also have in the US and which they also use in the European Union. And that would be especially important for the industrial regions of Russia, most of which are located in the Ural region or Siberia region, where you still have quite a lot of production facilities, and many of them still use older, outdated equipment, and there's obviously a need for modernization of that production. So that would be maybe issue number two. And then issue number three is global climate change, right? It's we'll call it global, but however, it has consequences all over the place. And Russia is also one of the countries which sees negative impacts of climate change. But Russia is also, interestingly, as you probably know, Russia is a country whose economy is very much dependent on fossil fuels, extraction and exports. So in a way, a big question for Russia is when the whole world is going to decarbonize their economy, so the demand for oil, gas, and coal will probably go down eventually. What are we going to do? So what is then the future of Russia's economy in this new world going green? And this is a really big ongoing discussion now, right in the country. So I'd probably say that.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
I want to follow up with the recycling issue. Do you see the government absorbing much of the need in that area, or will the private sector have to step up, or probably a partnership of some sorts?
Right, so the initial idea was that the private sector would take up, and that the private sector will also get some support from the government in order to develop the sector, launch the sector. And the idea was also that it will be financed through a very special environmental tax, which producers of any sort of packaging are paying at the moment, right? Like to reutilize their products. However, what has been happening over the last few years, the sector has not really taken up as quickly as they hoped. And I mean, there are recycling facilities. Like even back in Russia, I live in St. Petersburg, and around St. Petersburg, there are a few new recycling facilities appearing. But still, the sector is not developing that successfully and that quickly as I think many governmental and non-governmental experts have hoped. So now there's an ongoing debate about how do we change the system, do we give more support to that, how do we stimulate more recycling. So this is still like an ongoing debate at the moment.
Yeah. Any bright spots as far as you're concerned, or areas where there have been successes within the choices made by the private sector to put a sustainable model together?
I would probably bring up a few, like there's been these two recent success stories. One in Chelyabinsk, which is in the Ural region, and that's also probably known as one of the most polluted regions in the also in Russia, which still has a lot of industry, and which still has a lot of coal generation plants. So what they did there is that there's a company which actually originated from a grassroots civil society group, and then kind of turned into a company. Which does recycling of batteries. Okay. Yeah, and other harmful substances. And they were the first one to be launched in Russia. Before that, most of recycling of every batteries, you would need to take them to Finland or elsewhere, right? This is what we were doing in St. Petersburg, for example, if you were environmentally aware about these issues. So I would say, that was the first recycling facilities for such kind of waste up until recently, and now a second one opened in Novosibirsk, also in Siberia. And that sector, so these two enterprises, they seem to be getting like all of everything they need, all of the materials from all over the country. And they seem to be working on their full capacity. And that seems to be, functioning like a good model. Because a really big challenge for some of the recycling facilities, is that sometimes they don't get enough of materials that they need. Also due to the fact that in many regions, the whole system of separate garbage collection is still not there, right? Okay. So they need to try and get them out themselves somehow, right? In order. So in a way, it's a bit like a chicken and egg problem, right? What do you establish first? Do you establish a system of separate garbage collection, and then provide recycling facilities with that, or do you first create recycling facilities and then, so.
Well, I hope you could help them to answer those questions.
I have to.
So tell us about your time at the UN Climate Conference. What was accomplished during the event, and what was not accomplished?
I've been going to the UN Climate Conferences for the last 10 years. So this last conference in December 2018 in Poland, in Katowice, was my anniversary, my 10th conference.
Congratulations.
Thank you. So I've kind of been following the agenda for a long time by now. And, well, it's an exciting process. It's a very interesting process. It's a very important process where all of the countries get together and trying to do something to solve the global climate crisis. So they speak about emission reductions, they speak about financial mechanisms, they speak about economics. There's actually, like, if you tell that to, say, if I say that to my, I don't know, aunt or uncle, I'm going to the climate conference, they sometimes tend to think, there's like scientists speaking about climate change. Well, it's totally not so, right? There are serious business people, and it's not that scientists are not serious, scientists are also serious. But there are business people, there are representatives of ministries, politicians, mostly speaking about money. And so it's not that they're debating whether there is climate change or not, whether it's anthropogenic caused or not. It's mostly about money, financial mechanisms, development, financial mechanisms, connecting it to emission reduction and adaptation to climate change. So those are the main concerns. Yeah. What was the main topic at this very last conference is the work out the rules of the Paris Agreement. Back in 2015, countries have reached out on a new climate agreement, which is due to replace Kyoto Protocol, and that is called the Paris Climate Agreement. And the Paris Climate Agreement is it's basically very thin. It's something, I think, if I'm not wrong, it's 38 pages, so it's kind of something you can read over drinking a cup of coffee. And but it needs to be really and very thoroughly worked out on a number of points. And this is what countries and negotiators are doing at the moment. So they literally take every paragraph and they think, okay, what that exactly means. And they agree on a number of terms. What about reporting about emissions? How do you prove this reporting, these emissions? How do you verify them? When are countries expected to raise up their climate ambition? So all these issues. And also another very important topic is obviously economic mechanisms. We had a number of the so-called flexible mechanisms with the Kyoto Protocol, be it the CDM, Clean Development Mechanism, or Joint Implementation Mechanism, or just carbon trading, right, emission trading. So they're all kind of finished with Kyoto Protocol. So now there's this new mechanism with the Paris Agreement, which is called Sustainable Development Mechanism, but it hasn't been worked out yet. I mean, they've just started working on it, because this mechanism is set to transfer money and finance from particular sectors or particular countries to some other sectors and other countries and regions of the world, to allow for everyone to both bring their emissions down and adapt to climate change. And then specifically, maybe a few words about where are we now, because Please. I think this is also very interesting. So the Paris Agreement says, and all of the countries, well, almost all of the countries, let's put it like this, agreed on that, is that we have to keep the global temperature rise by 2 degrees Celsius. Well, Celsius, unfortunately, it's like, I think, 3.6 Fahrenheit, if I'm not mistaken, and aim for 1.5 Celsius, right? So this is like the target. So one of the basic principles of Paris Agreement is that countries didn't get their targets from above, but they came up with it themselves. So every country came up and said, okay, we are willing and we can reduce our emissions by X% to year Y, right? And if we look up at everything which countries have brought up together on the table, that probably takes the whole world to around 3 degrees Celsius. So we're not there yet, but we're also not completely lost. And then if we didn't do anything, and there was no UN climate process, and people were not gathering every year to discuss it and do something, we would probably be at around 4 or 5 degrees Celsius. Okay. So just, overall picture. Now, there are a number of serious challenges with the climate process, and they've become especially acute over the last couple of years. As you obviously know, the US have declared that they would leave the Paris Agreement. They haven't done that yet. They're still with the process. The US negotiators are still taking part, because it takes 4 years, actually, to leave the Paris Agreement. So they're still in. And there are a number of other issues which come up across many different regions of the world. From this yellow vest protests in France, which not ultimately, but in some ways, was still connected with the raise of carbon tax. Up till a big debate in Germany about exit from coal, like when is it happening and how. So all these questions about how do we combine green development with socially just development and with equity, this is one of the main issues which became very visible at this very last conference. So we've been speaking we and the scientists, we've been speaking for years about sustainable development. What is sustainable development? You always show these three circles, right? One, economic development, social development, and environmental, development, you can say,
Right.
environmental. And now we really came to a point when we realized this is actually challenging. And this is really hard to be able to, how do we provide for everyone to be happy under these transformations which we are going to? So I would say that was, obviously one of the most urgent issues. And then the second one was that, as already mentioned, some of the countries as states, right, they find it difficult and challenging to raise up their climate ambition to say, we'll reduce our greenhouse gases by 90% tomorrow, right? So this is hard. So countries are, in many ways, are rather conservative about going about that. But what we do see, this is growing ambition from non-country, non-national level actors. This is a sub-national level.
Okay.
Yeah? Be it states, like regions, right, of the country, be it cities, be it communities, or be it companies, right, who say, okay, we see what our country is doing, but we are eager and we can and we are able to take even more ambitious targets for us. And we think this is good for us and for the future of our business, if it's a company, or for the future of our development, if it's a region or a city. So we see a growing number of such initiatives, like sub-national initiatives. And it's a very interesting situation because theoretically, UN is about states getting together and discussing things. But the role of these actors is actually growing bigger and bigger. So now there's also a question, what do we do about it? And how do we, first account for that? How do we get all these initiatives together? How do we scale them up?
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, very exciting. I hope that more fruit will come from the discussions, and as you guys break down each of the paragraphs, better questions will be raised as you work towards a global solution.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So I wanted to switch topics here and talk a little bit about civil society in Russia today. Maybe you could share with us a little bit some thoughts about your ideas regarding civil society in Russia. What does it look like and what has changed over maybe the last 10 years as those discussions continue?
Right. I think this is a very interesting question, and that's a very exciting area, something to look at, what's happening in today's Russia, but also not only in Russia. Like I see similar processes in many other countries of the post-Soviet state.
Yes.
So in a way, very often the picture you get from international media coverage is that civil societies in these countries, and Russia in particular, is under constant threats and under constant pressure. So quite a few civil society groups, especially the ones which have been set up with the help of international aid or foreign aid, and which have been getting international money, like from a number of countries, or like international bodies, they've really came under pressure over the last few years. There's been this infamous foreign agent law in Russia adopted, which meant that if you are a registered NGO group and you engage in an activity which is considered to be political, but then the whole description of political is very blurry, which allows for the mismanagement and misinterpretation of that particular law. And then if you get money from elsewhere, like outside of Russia, then you should register as a foreign agent or made to be registered as a foreign agent, which means a lot more of reporting and like bureaucratic procedures. And it's also like you might find it difficult to work with countries' officials or local administrations and politicians. So it's kind of it's not a very easy thing to do, and it's also a bit like not a very positive label overall. So we've seen that process on one hand, which led to the fact that many NGOs were sued by the authorities for not doing it. Quite a few of them closed down. Quite a few of them got very large fines, which they weren't able to pay. So many of them either closed down or re-registered themselves in some other forms, maybe as like companies or social entrepreneurship initiatives. Some did close down. So on one hand, you see the kind of this trend, like overall the trend from the side of the state to try and put control of the NGO sector, like what is being done with which money, what does NGO doing, why is it critical towards the state. So basically any kind of criticism coming from big NGOs group is kind of not being very positively looked upon. So on one hand, you have this trend. On the other hand, you also, right over the last maybe 10 years or 8 years, you have another trend of growing of other, I would say, not always other, but mainly other kinds of civil society initiatives, which sometimes don't get registered as NGOs and remember to work as initiatives. And they mainly deal not with the, so to say, high-level issues as, you know, human rights or democracy or elections or other things, but they tend to deal with very down-to-earth issues, which people in many regions across Russia find it to be super important.
Yes.
Be it waste, be it environmental rights, right? When there's a park being cut down next to the place where you live in order for the new construction, new urban development taking place. Like, what do you do, right? Be it rights of people with special needs, be it other social NGOs, which provide support for people from socially disadvantaged communities, be it human rights on the very basic level, right? When you experience like human rights offending in taking place in a police station, right? Like where do you go about it? So you see all across the country, well, maybe mostly in urban areas, growing of these initiatives. You know, a bit like mushroom growing after.
Great. Glad to hear that.
So once again, the whole sector is now, it's very hard to analyze it because there are so many processes taking place. Some of these initiatives are short-living. So once the cause is there, they leave, then they kind of disperse.
Okay.
Some of them rebrand themselves or restructure themselves and also start working on other issues. Some of them merge with someone else and build up coalition. Say in Moscow, in the end of last year, quite a lot of these very local groups fighting for green parks, they kind of joined themselves in a coalition and will try to lobby their interests at the level of city government, you know, kind of becoming a bigger power than they would be if they were every single one of them. And as I mentioned earlier, many of them don't get registered as NGOs, and most of them don't even have people working for them full time. So in a way, those are people who have their jobs and then do something else in addition to it, because they worry about their quality of life. They worry about their safety. They worry about the future of their children. They worry about other, like very down-to-earth things. And this is really a very interesting process. This is really, you know, because sometimes these groups do get very professional and they learn how to do lobbying at the local level. They learn how to present and protect and put forward their interests. They learn how to organize, do community organizing, right? How to actually bring people in a protest movement if that is needed. They learn how to work on social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, or elsewhere. And sometimes they also do come under pressure. Sometimes you also have, you know, legal cases against particular people, right, not organizations, because they're under organization. Sometimes people get, you know, arrested for a few days for organizing a protest rally. But overall, I would say the whole idea that this new sprouts of grassroots civil society is there, and it's developing in a very interesting way. This is something, obviously, to follow and to analyze and to take a look. I find this particular trends to be very exciting, and I'm trying to follow them now.
How very exciting indeed, and how intrinsically motivated the people are that even in the current system, they're working to make the initiatives become true solutions, and I hope that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Angelina, thank you so very much. It's been a pleasure to speak with you today.
And on my side, likewise, thank you so much for having me here.
Sure. Next time you come back, I hope we can hear more about the positive initiatives both in the environmental sector and within civil society going to the next level. That would be exciting.
Absolutely. That would be my wish.
Great.
Okay,
thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's all the time we have for this edition of CIBER Focus. Thank you for tuning in. If you have any comments or suggestions for future topics, please let us know at cyber, that's CIBER, @indiana.edu.